Welcome to what turned out to be the first in the 2016 series, because we were snowed out last week. And if you picked up the schedule out there, you'll see that we have rescheduled Woolwich's presentation for the end of the series on February 20th. As usual, this is a series that is officially sponsored by Bath Historical Society and the library, but in reality, it's sponsored by all the historical societies, because every year I go to each one, or in the case of Arousik, to people interested in Arousik history, and they line up a speaker and topic for me. So without their participation, there would be no town history series. And I wanted to mention that the title Town History Series is purposeful to show that this is a series exploring the history of all the towns that support the library, all 5. So it's not the Bath Library, it's the Patten Free Library supported by Georgetown, Arousik, Woolwich, West Bath, and Bath. So we have five talks in this series every year. We used to have 6 when Phippsburg was a supporter of the library. And this is our 12th year. 12 years with, I think, only 2 cancellation reschedulings. But fingers crossed for the rest of this season. But this week, Robin Haynes, most of you know Robin very well, manager of the History Room, and very much a Bath historian and an architectural historian to boot. So that is her take on the history of the library today. It's from an architectural perspective, a peek, a look at the history of Patten Free Library. Robin.
Thank you. Will somebody get the lights, please? Lights.
Steve.
Thank you. Okay. So, the question is, from whence cometh this library, this tower, this cross between a fanciful tower that holds Rapunzel, who might let down her hair and allow you to come in and read books, and a fortified medieval tower with small windows or arrow slits from which librarians can shoot arrows at those who might threaten the collection. We're going to talk about that today, looking briefly at the history of libraries in Bath, the architect who designed the building, George Edward Harding, and Harding's design, which is based on the work of the most famous architect of the period. I hope that later you feel you understand better how this building, which opened 125 years ago this very month, came to be designed and built here. Although we think of libraries as beginning in Bath with the 1847 Patten Library Association, there were earlier libraries, some of which were absorbed by the Patent Association, which was a subscription or social library. Before public or free libraries, there were other institutions that offered their subscribers access to reading material. The term social library has come to signify that kind of library, which generally provided a circulating collection of materials and frequently a reading room for the use of their joint owners or stockholders. None of the published histories of Bath indicate when the first library started here in Bath. They write about the circulating library in the apothecary store of Dr. Nathaniel Weld on Center Street, dating approximately 1826, and several other informal libraries in retail settings slightly later. In the History of Bath by Henry Owen, he noted that the incorporation of the Bath Public Library was about 1827, but he indicated that was all he could find out about that library, the only mention. But we now know more than that. We know that the Bath Public Library was absorbed by the Patent Library Association when the association was formed in November of 1847, and you're looking at that agreement. And there I'm highlighting the names of those 2 institutions and the date. We also know that the Bath Public Library was incorporated in 1826, and that it had in turn, and this is its agreement, absorbed an earlier library, the Bath Social Library. But the question has remained, just when was the Bath Social Library formed? But Peter and I learned that this fall. We received this bookplate from a bookplate collector who decided, after some discussion, that we really did need it more than he did. And we have verified that this is indeed Bath, Maine, by finding in the Redex over at Bowdoin College, the early American imprints of ephemera, the rules and regulations for the social library in the town of Bath, started indeed in June of 1799. So we know that at least there has been a library in Bath for 215 and a half years, open to the public for a fee, whether you were a resident of Bath or the neighboring communities, as typical of the time. So in a sense, since one library ate another, we could almost say that the Patten Library started in 1799. Almost 50 years after that bookplate, the Patten Library Association was formed in 1847, when on October 9th, 1847, 132 leading citizens, headed by the brothers, George and John Patten, agreed to become subscribers in a joint stock library. The subscribers met at the office of Dr. Israel Putnam, which was in his home. And some of you may know that particular home because it's just across the street, now known as the Cosmopolitan Club. So it seems rather serendipitous that the Patten Association started across from where the future home of the library would be in 42 years. The association was initially located several places, in a single room at the rear of Reuben Sawyer's office, the first librarian, as you can see in this notice from the paper, and at some point in a room that, according to Parker McCobb Reed's history, was over the archway in a building owned by the Moses brothers, and the library began to grow. An important step in that growth was the acquisition by the Patten brothers of the King Library, which they donated to the Patten Reading Association. That was a significant step. And the Pattens were involved in the running of this quite at an early stage, really when it started. By the late 1850s, George Patten has stepped down from being president of the association he had helped to start. He was asked if he would allow a bust to be done of himself to be displayed in the reading room over the arch. But he demurred. George probably thought this was rather an inappropriate self-promotion, because in the late 1850s, Bath is beginning to experience severe economic difficulties. Besides, there's the small detail that he'd have to pay for it himself. But John Patten came through, providing a bust at some point, which I imagine you've all noticed in the reading room. That marble sculpture was done about 1860, I believe, by John Adams Jackson, a nationally recognized sculptor who was born in Bath, but took his skill first to Boston and then to Italy, which is where all good American sculptors go in the 19th century. The painting of George Ferguson Patten, now in the library, is a copy of a family painting done by his granddaughter Emily Slade and given to the library probably late in the 19th century or early in the 20th century. But the Pattens just don't give art, and they don't just give books. They provided space. In May of 1879, John Patten provided a new home for the Patten Library Association, a substantially larger space than rooms over the arch, with a building on Center Street, as you can see highlighted there. Patten noted that once the city of Bath instituted a public library and appropriated funds for its support, then he would give the property fully to the Library Association. And the books, over 3,000, were transferred in early 1880. This is a Sanborn insurance map. You can see, obviously, that this is Center, this is Front Street, and it's on the north side of the street, basically where the sweet shop stands now. This is another type of map, the bird's eye map, again showing Center Street, Front Street, Now You're Cooking, the Saginaw House, and that's where the Patten Library is. And one more look at that particular. This is a stereoscopic view from probably 1865, 66, possibly 1867. So before the move of the library to the street, technically. And that is where Patten Library is going to be established. This is part of the Susan Beagle collection. It was on eBay just a couple months ago, and she was kind enough to buy it for the history room. But the reason why I knew about this image in the first place was because of the work of Carrie Nelson, who reviews eBay for the Bath Historical Society and the history room regularly, and also helps us with research, both Peter and myself, I'd say almost every week. And we are indebted to her. But the nature of libraries is changing during this time. Before this picture, in 1854, a Maine law was passed that allowed taxation for the establishment and maintenance of public libraries. And as the years moved on, social reformers thought that libraries could change a host of problems for the members of the working class, improve their education, reduce the social ills of an increasingly industrial society in America, and so forth. But you know, sometimes the money just isn't there in a civic budget. But letters began appearing as early as the time of this photograph in 1865, suggesting that a true public library was needed. One particularly pithy editorial in 1883 stated it rather bluntly, and I'm going to read it to you. Speaking of the nearness of long evenings and cold weather, suggests the old subject of a public library. We wish the next rich old duffer who dies and gives his thousands to foreign missions would devote a portion of his wealth toward a public library for Bath. We don't want a little white house with not enough room inside in which to wag one's elbows and whose eaves a small boy can reach on tiptoe, but a handsome brick or stone building, commodious in interior, as beautiful in externals, and above all, well filled with history. Books of science, books of history, of biography, travel, truth, and fiction, and all free. The Patten Library has been of excellent use and great advantage, and a source of much pleasure, but still it's not doing so much good as would a free public library. Other cities have them, Little Gardner, and smaller Hallowell on our own Kennebec possess fine libraries and handsome buildings devoted to their use. Why can't we have one? End of quote. It took a few more years, but a rich old duffer came through with his usual generous flair. And of course, that would be Galen Moses, who the city is greatly indebted to on several points. He wrote an article, actually a letter, which he had published in the paper, in the Bath Daily Times of February 1887. And he also went to the Patten Library Association to discuss his proposal. So about 129 years ago in 2 weeks, this letter from Galen Moses on page 1 offered $10,000 for a public library. Of course, he also wanted to abolish politics and municipal elections and elect a temperance mayor, but he was truly serious about the library, and he was putting his money where his mouth was. Within that article, it said, "One thing our city needs is a good public library, free to every man, woman, or child in the city, with a public reading room which should offer its attractions to the young and old, offering one more place to draw them away from wasting their time and substance in ways I need not now speak of in detail." Though since he put it that way, aren't we all wondering? But back to his writing. Such a library in some respectable location would be of inestimable benefit to our city. If a location could be had on the park grounds on Washington Street, on the southwest corner, it would be accessible to a large share of our people and far more credible than its use as a dump ground has been. If such a project could be wisely set on foot in unison with the Patten Library and our city would assume the expense of its care, I would be willing in the year 1888, or in season to build that year, to give for such a building the sum of $10,000. He actually gives more than that. I think it is north of $15,000 as a matter of fact. This, of course, from the bird's eye map, is the park he's referring to, Washington, Linden, Summer, and Front. And he's talking about this corner as the dump ground. It's also known at the time as the Swamp and the Frog Pond. And it's, of course, now where the Spirit of the Sea resides. There are also other spaces considered. This is considered, but you see there are a couple structures in the way because the city does not hold the entire block. And this place was also considered a former church, which had been changed into a carriage factory, which had this time gone defunct. So, but they do decide to concentrate in the long run on this corner. And 24 interested citizens help with the purchase of the land. In an article of March 1888, it's mentioned that several designs are under consideration by Mr. Moses. And it's noted that perhaps the most desirable one is the one furnished by George Edward Harding of New York City, a Bath-born boy. He is furnishing excellent plans and specifications, according to the newspaper, free. I'm not sure if that last detail made them much more attractive to Galen Moses, who is choosing the design as the individual paying for the structure and approving the choice of sites. But certainly it didn't hurt. So a Harding plan and others were offered more than a year and a half before the property was fully obtained and construction begun. But they knew from his letter the location that he was generally considering. This is George Edward Harding, the architect, that Bath boy, Bath born and raised, who is trained as an engineer at Columbia College and also has additional training in London. But his career and practice was centered in New York City, largely doing commercial buildings, but probably doing whatever walked in the door of the architectural firm. This is one of those buildings. This is the Holland House, done when he was in partnership with Gooch, though it amuses me no end that the firm was called George Edward Harding and Gooch. Gooch's first name was William, middle name was Tyson. I think you should know that even if it's not in the name. And this was done in 1890, so before the library is finished, but not before it started. This still stands at the corner of 5th Avenue and 30th. This is the Postal Telegraph building that the same firm did, finishing in 1894. Has a nice deeply recessed opening cut into the bottom there, carved terracotta. There are a lot of nice things about the building I don't have time to tell you about, but I did want to tell you that the New York Daily Tribune was thrilled with this building, not for the architecture per se, but for the engineering, the innovative call button for the elevator. They thought that was so much more civilized than having to shout, up, down. And I would agree with that. This is located, as I might have said, at 253 Broadway Street, still standing. This is the Gherkin building, which is at 90 West Broadway, also still standing. And it has been converted from commercial to condominiums in case you're looking for a New York condominium. But we really want to focus largely on one building today, and that is the design of the Patten Free Library in Bath, and the most desirable plan. As I told you, the newspaper labeled it. Harding grew up in Bath, as I mentioned, in the home of his parents, Edward and Louisa Harding, which was purchased in the early 1850s. He was the eldest of their 6 children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. That house should look familiar to you if you only glanced out the window on your way into the talk, because his mother lived across from the site where the library would be built. And while it is not his first building in Bath, it was, at the time, his most elaborate. And his dad was dead by that point. But his mom could look out her front windows and see the building her boy designed being built and being recognized by people for the lovely thing that it is. That must have been quite a remarkable thing to look out your window and see that. So I mentioned his father was Edward Harding. Edward Harding came to Bath as a very young child and had a variety of careers. Ship chandler, shipbuilder, was also involved with the telegraph in Bath, a knitting machine, the ice industry, and banking. But he's best known for beginning the Bath City Greys in 1850, a local militia. And when the Civil War began, some of you may know that the Greys were the only militia that became a complete unit. They were Company A of the 3rd Maine Regiment. And Edward Harding himself became the acting quartermaster for the state of Maine, and therefore was responsible for equipping every regiment that left the state during the war. He dies at the age of 57 in 74, but I think he left rather large shoes for his eldest son to fill. And despite the fact that his practice was indeed in New York City, he continued to advertise from time to time in the Bath newspaper. Get work where you can find it. The first building he did in Bath was the Goss Iron Works. I do not have a drawing or photograph of the Goss Iron Works. I don't know if one exists. It does. I see from a nodding head by Mr. Nathan Lipford in the audience. I don't know which building it is, but I was going to guess that it is this one. And there is an affirmative possibility sounding from the audience, but I don't know. It could be from where all the chimneys are emitting. This is obviously the Bath Iron Works, which bought the Goss Marine Iron Works, but I wanted to show you something. Another building that he was responsible for in Bath, I'm sure a lot of you know, not as the Albert Shaw residence, but as Hotel Sedgwick, and that was built around 1900. And he also did the parish hall or chapel for the Central or Chocolate Church in 1901. But again, back to this design, this tower, these wonderfully sharp roof lines and deeply cut arches. This is how the building appeared in the Bath Independent of 1895. And if we compare the two, you can see that there are some differences. The drawings on the dark brown are likely presentation drawings. They were done by Harding himself, and we have the two drawings. One is hanging in the history room if you want to go look at it later, and one is in the director's office. You can see that they're in need of some conservation, which we hope will happen in the coming years. But you can see that in Harding's original design, there are windows up here, and these were just replaced by recessed masonry panels as it was built. And the amount of window space is slightly larger in the original design. The proportion of windows is slightly different. But other than that, it's very similar indeed. One of the other changes was the addition of windows on the front. You know that there are little windows on either side of the front door, and there's only one here when there are actually 4. This is a Romanesque revival building. This was a style initially used for massive public buildings and churches, but later it trickles down to be used for libraries, train stations, and private homes even. There are some beautiful Romanesque revival homes. The materials are always masonry by definition. Brick, rough stone, always. And often there's a belt course to sort of separate materials, a band that separates the floors or the different materials. There are usually slate roofs with metal finials on top, and there is often terracotta detailing. But when you look at an architectural style, you need to look at it 2 ways. And if afterwards we had all decided, because I really do want to do this, when I gave this talk a little earlier, I said this, but no one took me up on it. I think we should do the building blocks of American architecture and create a building block set for children of wood. But I need some very skilled wood carvers because we need to carve blocks that look like these buildings. And you can see that the shape of this block is a little complicated. Romanesque revival is a composition where we're taking different kind of blocky components, often with a curved component to one or more of those components, and putting them together in an asymmetrical composition. Not like a nice rectangular federal building. This is going to be a hard block to carve. But the other part of the blocks that we have to make is we have to paint detailing on the blocks. We need not just to get the curves and the steepness of it, the steeply flared roofs. We also need to get the details. We need to paint some little bricks on this block because the brick itself almost becomes ornamentation, or the stone in other examples, because it emphasizes the curve. You wrap around the tower or wrap around the reading room. We need to paint the doorways under the arches, whether it's sheltered and recessed or whether it has ornamentation that continues to emphasize that arch and the transom above it. And if you're going to talk details, you have to talk arches in Romanesque revival. Whether it's the recessed arch that a doorway is in, the arch of a window, or the arch over the doorway, the arch of the transom. Arches are terribly important to Romanesque revival. Windows are often grouped in pairs or even more commonly in threes, but they're different sizes and shapes so that you see the narrow windows on either side of the entrance on the slide to the right, and in the middle you see the arched window. And we'll see some more arched windows. Another thing that you'll find are lintels of soldier bricks, as you see here. Soldier bricks are bricks that are standing on end, like soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, rather than horizontally. They also have a particular type of ornamentation, usually that's very flowing and foliate, or imitating leaves or vegetation. Here we have this in the curlicues around the plaque on the front of the library. Have you ever noticed that it doesn't say Patten Free Library? It says Public Library. And I would guess that it used to be dark red. That's just a guess, though. Construction began in summer of 1889. The foundation was finished in September. The shipment by water of 45,000 plus bricks from the Sayer, Fisher and Company of New Jersey was delayed by storms until October 9th. But the Slaters, Born and Son of Portland, seen in this picture, started in late November of 1889, 126 years ago. So I think that we can see that that photograph is probably November, December. And how many roofers do you see? Yes, 4. You don't want to miss this guy on top of the tower. Okay. The masons were Edward Hacker of Brunswick and his workers, who were nearly finished by December 19th. They were finishing up the 2 fireplaces in Roman brick. Roman brick is larger in width and thinner, which were to be laid with red mortar, as was the exterior stonework. You might be able to tell that there is a dark line between these stones, not a light line. And that's going to come up later, so remember it. The other thing you need to know is in January of 1890, the plumbers, the Foote brothers of Bath, later evolve into the Redland firm, began to put in the steam heating apparatus. By January 20th of 1890, there was heat, so that means the plasterers could begin. And the newspaper began to explain what the interior would be like. I'm reading from the Bath Daily Times of June 10th, 1890. Passing over the broad granite steps of the western entrance, one stands in a neat hallway with a floor of imported Italian tiles and heavily finished in ash. To the right is the approach to the stairway leading to the Historical Society room, while on the left is the office of the librarian, commanding quite a general view of the lower floor. Passing into the reading room, one finds himself in a lofty room, its ceiling being the top of the building. To the right is a handsome open fireplace of spotted Newark brick, and from the windows one may look down into the harbor. Let me interrupt to just say, look at the arch of soldier brick. Again, the arches that are so important to the Romanesque style, and the windows on either side of the fireplace. On the left is an arched double doorway leading to the library, and by that the newspaper means the stacks. The slanted ceiling is straw-colored. The walls are light blue, while the finish of solid ash at the angles gives a rich effect to the whole. This is the ash they're talking about. And the floors are of oiled birch. Did you know that it's currently in its original colors? Passing through the light railing which crosses at the base of the broad arch leading to the library, one stands in a high, light room with rows of ash shelves for books on either hand and a wide, low window looking out upon the park. Between the 2 bronze radiators is a heavy table where the researcher may pursue his or I might add, or her, facts. A straw-colored ceiling and chocolate-tinted walls combine harmoniously with the solid finish of the room. The building is fitted throughout for gas or electricity and is heated by steam, with registers in addition for the main room. I want to draw your attention in this period photograph, which may be as late as 1895 or maybe as early as 1891. There is a curved bay window on the north end of the library. I want you to observe that railing, which is separating you from the books. And there's a reason for that. You're just going to put them back in the wrong place. I also wanted to mention to you that you see the edge of that arch in this period photograph. It's not filled in the way it is today. It just has the railing separating you. So how do you get those books you want? Well, you would get a finding list, either at the library or at the local bookstore. Shaw's bookstore and Office Supply carried them, where you would look up the book you wanted, like, I don't know, let's go for, because it catches my eye, Boy Travelers in Egypt in the Holy Land. And you would give a slip with the name, the author, and its shelf location to the librarian, who would go and get it. And it was written in the newspaper that Miriam Newman, the librarian, knew her books so well that if you just told her the title, she would know where on the shelf it was. We're not talking alphabetical by author or title. And there is Miriam, I believe, waiting for you to tell her what you need. And this gives us a nice look at what I find very intriguing. The radiators were round. Isn't that cool? And here, when I talk about clear story, I'm talking about these high windows that are to let in light, in case you're confused when I bring that up later. And from the outside, this is a early 20th century illustration from the Scenic Gems of Bath. But see the bay window? And I might note that the gazebo was here probably 7 years before the building was built. It preceded the library, and it was designed by Francis Fassett, a Bath boy too. And going back to that article from June 10th, 1890, and before I start reading it again, I would ask, do you recognize that railing and that gate? Yes, you do, from the earlier slide. So, today, workmen began removing the red mortar in the stonework of the public library to replace it by some color which harmonizes more satisfactorily with the rest of the work, probably white. When this is done, the building can be called practically finished, and a party of ladies who went through the rooms this morning were among the first to express their pleasure at the finished work. The historical room, and now you're going up the staircase to it, is one of the most pleasing of apartments, and the railed balcony projecting from it over the main room is one of the features of the building. The time of dedication has not yet been definitively determined upon, but it will come in the very near future, and then Bath will have a public building of which she may well be proud. Why it took another 6 months, I don't know. No one ever addresses that in the paper, and I will tell you I read all of them for that 6-month period. I did want to remind you that the Historical Society, which lived in the tower, and that space was designed explicitly for the Historical Society, was the Saginaw Historical Society. That was formed in 1877. By the early 20th century, it's become inactive, and in 1911 is when the children's room gained its own space up in the tower. Of course, they got a larger space when the addition was done in the 1960s. And about 100 years after the first Historical Society was formed, the space became a history room again in the tower. And about 8 years after that, 10 years after that, the Bath Historical Society was formed. So, I think by now you've noticed the interior arches, the masonry, all of these details and forms on the inside and outside of the Romanesque Revival style. But I think the question still remains, whence cometh this tower, this echo of fortified medieval castles, or the clear-story windows of book stacks as if it were in a church nave, or the curved apse-like quality of the reading room with its altar of view of the Kennebec River? Where does Harding find his inspiration to build this as the Bath Public Library? He follows the leader. This is a list that was created by architects in 1885 of the top 10 buildings as the profession themselves saw it. Now, you notice one name at the top of the list? Henry Hobson Richardson. And you notice it's repeated and repeated. So, do you see someone you think Harding is likely to consider as a source of ideas? And do you know why the American interpretation of Romanesque revival is almost always called Richardsonian Romanesque? This is Henry Hobson Richardson. He was born and raised in New Orleans. He attended Harvard, the site of two of his future buildings, although one biographer sniped that there's not evidence that he ever saw the inside of a library as an undergraduate. And there are pictures. He was a tall and lanky undergraduate. But the connections he made while there would help his career tremendously. He went on right after his degree at Harvard to Paris to the École des Beaux-Arts. But he's trapped there by the Civil War, and while he tries to come home, his sympathies are with the Union and his family is in Louisiana. And they tell him to pretty much stay where he is, that it just is going to be safer. And he comes back after the Civil War and starts his business. This portrait was unfortunately finished shortly after his death. He had traded work with the artist von Herkimer in Europe so that he designed a house for Herkimer, and Herkimer did the portrait. And as Herkimer called the man after his death, big-bodied, big-hearted, large-minded, and full-brained. And that's certainly evidenced by the roundness, which does take rather center stage in this portrait. And if you just didn't notice it, we've got this nice round vase to emphasize this lovely round belly. And of course, you all know that this was the time where being a large man was a sign of success, not an impending heart condition. But you can see, since he doesn't even make 50, that something else was brewing. And to me, it's a tragedy. What this man might have accomplished in his later years, who knows? He also liked to wear medieval monk's garb and be photographed that way. I don't know whether it was because it was more comfortable for his girth or whether he's signaling to you the source of his inspiration. But this is the church that was the prize, that was number one in the contest. This is Trinity Church. This is a period photograph. It was dedicated in 1877. What's interesting is that that wasn't the only competition this building won. There was a competition for the design for Trinity Church. So Richardson's firm won that in 1872. And you can see that grouping of blocking elements. You can see the multiple hipped steep roofs. You can see the masonry, certainly. You can see the use of belt courses to separate. And what's interesting to me is this building looks ancient and it's new. And that's what he wanted. That's the building in more current appearance. It shows the texture and the color much better when you can see it in color. It's beautiful inside and out. I might just add for your trivia knowledge that the tower was designed to be twice the height it is. But they found that the made land there simply wouldn't support a tower of that height. And if we look on the inside, you can see he's still playing with arches, with color, texture. It's a stunning building. It will take your breath away. But what is Richardson looking at? He's looking at 11th and 12th century Romanesque buildings. He's looking at the old stuff, the truly old stuff. This is the Notre Dame de Port in the Auvergne region of France. And you can see it's grouped just the same type of blocky, rounded components, the same steep roofs. I mean, it almost looks like it grew organically. It's a little group of mushrooms growing up out of the soil with these components kind of hugging each other, creating a very asymmetric composition by and large. Symmetrical from some positions for this particular one. Very rich surfaces. And to show you another one, This is the Vézelay Abbey, now known as the Basilica of Sainte Marie Madeleine in France, dedicated in 1104. This is the major starting point for pilgrims on the way of St. James to Santiago de Compostela. First dedicated in 1104, there are subsequent editions. That's the exterior. You can see the arches, the masonry. If I move inside, you can see the arches repeated. That arched area is called a tympanum, very elaborately carved. There is a lot of elaborate ornamentation in these buildings, sometimes done by rather folk sculptors or with naive ideas. They're very playful. There are views of things like Adam and Eve, which just make you crack up when you look at them. If you are in this area, I highly recommend you go see Vézelay. But I also wanted to emphasize that the arches are not just decorative, they are structural. So you get these series of barrel vaults creating a beautiful visual, but they're holding up that building. It's not just because they liked the look of arches, it's for the support that an arch can create. We know that Richardson saw a lot of these when he was in France in school, but we also know that he returns to Europe in 1882 and that he followed the St. James Way through France and Spain. And we know, in fact, that he bought a photograph of this particular building, a small Casa de Dona Maria la Brava in Salamanca. And I think what he's fascinated by are the huge stones making up that arch. And he's also seeing that this doesn't have to be a complicated design. It can be simple and perhaps be stronger, richer in its composition. So when he comes home, he starts building things that are, in some respects, more restrained than Trinity Church and some of the other things. This is the Glesner House in Chicago. And you can see this public face is almost, well, certainly restrained, I guess is the word I'm going to use again. But still, it's got the arches, the grouped windows, the steep roof. If we could see the other side, we would see the embedded round towers, which are executed in brick, because the private or family side of this building is somewhat more playful. And the arches that he's using in a more isolated way now around the entrances and getting you closer to those entrances. This is the front door. Again, huge stones and restricting the ornamentation. This is the service entrance. Would that I had a side door that elegant. It's just gorgeous. If you are someone who's looked at the work of Louis Sullivan or Frank Lloyd Wright, you see where they are looking to. Richardson influenced people of the next generation and many generations to come. This could be in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and most of you wouldn't argue with me. It really does look it. And I wanted to bring your attention, do you see what color that mortar is? It's red, isn't it? Because that's a signature element for Richardson. And while Harding used it in his design, and therefore that's one of the reasons I know he's looking at Richardson, evidently the public that looked at that building going up said, oh, no, red mortar, inharmonious, got to get rid of that. So indeed it was. While Richard did a lot of large, magnificent buildings, I think some of his masterpieces are the small libraries, particularly in Massachusetts. And it's those buildings that I believed influenced Harding and his peers in particular. These are two of them. There are probably 5 or 6 in Massachusetts. I think there's one in Vermont. And I might be forgetting one. He also did small and large train stations and courthouses and all sorts of things. So these are done before Galen Moses has even published his letters. So they're definitely ones that Harding could be looked to. And you can see those same ideas in terms of the arch, the towers, and also the windows are giving you clues as how the space is being used. We know with that amount of windows, that's the reading room. We know by those high windows that that's the stacks. Stacks, reading rooms, probably a staircase tower. And I wanted to show you in an inside because I find it interesting. Richardson persisted in designing open stacks, which were the way social libraries, that were where we started this talk, were organized. So you could go find an alcove to sit in and read to your heart's content. And as I said, put the books back in the wrong place. Which might be why, in the early 1880s, the newly formed American Library Association endorsed the use of closed stacks. And they kept scolding Richardson for doing open stacks, but he was the designer. He did what he wanted. And these ideas are repeated throughout the United States, in libraries, definitely in Maine. With Francis Fassett's library of the Baxter Library, look at the texture of Trinity as well as the shapes. The Buck Memorial Library in Bucksport by George Clough. The Callis Library by Arthur Vinell. The Brown Memorial Library that was designed by John Calvin Stevens. The Lithgow Library in Augusta by Neal and Hopkins, and again to George Clough, and the Porter Memorial Library in Machias. I could have shown you more Maine libraries that are Richardsonian Romanesque, and I certainly could have shown you some train stations, small and large, in Maine. But in Bath, there is only one other Richardsonian Romanesque building built in Bath, and that serendipitously is across the street from the library. John Calvin Stevens designed this for the corner after a fire in 1893. The rounded corner, as if it swallowed its tower. The appearance almost of an arcade of arches as the ornamentation joins those variously arched windows. The ornamentation on the corner, that is the characteristic foliate ornamentation. Not only the grouping of the windows, and even the ornamentation that surrounds the angels that look over Bath. John Calvin Stevens also presented drawings to Mr. Moses, and this is what the Bath Public Library could have looked like. You can see it's still Richardsonian Romanesque. With that arched entranceway, here's the reading room, there are the stacks. And we are lucky enough, because the Maine Historical Society saved these things, to see what he intended for the inside. And you see the fireplace is again separated by an arch. It also has windows on either side of the fireplace and toward the Kennebec with small panes in them. The library opened on January 1st, 1891, and this is an article in the paper a couple days before explaining what's going to happen, because you first have to go get your library card, of course. And a few days into the new year, they mention already 300 cards have been issued. And they're telling the public about the regulations, which I am not going to tell you all about. But I'm going to tell you that it wasn't restricted to Bath residents, though non-residents had to pay $2 a year, or $1 for 6 months. But what I wanted to tell you, oh yes, is that in order to get a library card, you had to have a reference from a corporator. You had to have a recommendation, whether you were a Bath resident or not. And the library was open every day but Sunday. And what I really like, and those of you who know me well will understand, is that they were sensitive to the fact that there are people who stay up late in life reading. And so the library didn't open until 1:30 in the afternoon and stayed open until 9. Not everybody, however, thought that it was a gorgeous building. As you can see from this letter, a year and a month or so after the library opened, someone had seen a painting done by one of the, actually George Newman was also a librarian and the father of a librarian, in a storefront on Front Street, and thought how pretty the building looked in the painting. And he didn't think it looked anything like the building itself, which he found rather ugly and homely. And as you can see, it's stuck right up there on the corner of nowhere. He felt it looked like it was going to tumble down on us. And certainly that tower does seem very high from time to time. But it has also changed. Perhaps its proportions have been softened by the additions, because our library has grown from that original Richardsonian Romanesque fortress. Douglas Goodspeed completed a design in 1961 for the Wright Barker Wing, and in 1998, TFH Architects and Ambeja's design further increased the library. I have to admit that I'm somewhat partial to the later addition, because, as you now know, they echoed the curved bay window on the north end of the building that was on the original design. And they also repeated the little arrow slits, teaching children that books are something to be protected and cherished. So, whence cometh this tower? 216 years or more of libraries in Bath, the desire to provide sources of learning and pleasure in reading for everyone, and the generosity of many donors, particularly Galen Moses' vision. The imagination of a local boy who took a current trend from a very famous American architect's work and made it Bath's own. We have a tower for Rapunzel and Harry Potter, and a place to escape in the spy novels of Le Carré. We can hide in the reading room with Shakespeare's Macbeth, or a large print romance by Barbara Cartland. We can ponder the observations of Oliver Sacks, Joan Didion, or David McCullough, or just find some good cooking recipes, or how to build a table, or the headlines of the Boston Globe. In this library, we protect the past of Bath and the neighboring communities, and we fortify the future. But we're going to keep those windows from which to shoot arrows. Thank you.